So what I want to talk about, when we think about interdisciplinary, integrated, what comes to your mind? And when we say integrating different subject matter, right? What comes to your mind right away?
Multiple subjects are used in teaching one lesson.
Okay, so in one lesson, yeah, multiple subject matter, right? That's pretty much like a common sense or consensus, right? So when we hear this term. But I want to be more specific, I want to propose some specific ways to frame interdisciplinary learning, or how to connect multiple disciplines in one lesson or in one unit. Okay. Well, the background, why we want to do this, after all, right? I mean, traditionally, if we do math, we teach math. If we do science, within science. If we teach physics, we do physics, right? But I think there's high demand into the workforce, first of all, the frontier research and development. Now they have like large teams working on these big, complex problems that require a multidisciplinary team, right? And also, I mean, a lot of these innovations, creations, inventions, they happen at these disciplinary boundaries. Okay. Anyone has any example?
Not exactly for that, but every time when I think back on like my physics career, calculus has always been part of it. So that's one thing that's like pretty integrated, calculus and physics.
Right. To us, I mean, when you think about this, when you need to fix some problem, I don't know, maybe there's a problem in your AC system or in your car, right? A lot of times you need to combine what you know, and these problems, these daily situations, they don't necessarily present themselves, oh, hey, I'm a physics problem, solve me, right? And you have to think about, what disciplinary knowledge you need to apply, Oh, maybe I learned something about mechanics, maybe I learned something about, I don't know, math, right? So I think that presents this practical needs that we need to help our students. We cannot assume, oh, they can do, interdisciplinary learning application automatically. We need to help them, right? And so, I mean, these national standards, they do emphasize, actually, interdisciplinary connections. For example, you've read about these mathematical practices, right? Some of these are, when you read them, they're kind of similar to the science and engineering practices. I don't know if you, care to compare and contrast them in detail. For example, the use of mathematical models. That particular practice is mentioned both in the math standards and also the science and engineering standards, right? And then in a concrete example, the NGSS, Next Generation Science Standards. That document makes explicit connections to English and also math standards, actually. I think the math standards, the national standards, the Common Core, it does not really connect or list the other standards, right, if I'm correct. Uma, you probably know.
You are, yeah. It's just not.
So, and some of these discipline-specific science education documents emphasize the interdisciplinary nature, and in this particular report by AAAS, they're talking about biology learning at the college level, and they list like 6 principles, and 2 of them are asking students to make connections to other subject matter, actually. Okay. But before we move on to what we need to do in classrooms, I would like to present some definitions. Although we sort of agree, when we hear the words interdisciplinary or integrated, but I just want to make some nuanced distinction. So here, discipline is very simple. In this context, it's just subject matter we teach in schools, right? Math. And within sciences, we do physics, biology, earth science, And here, I want to distinguish these two terms, interdisciplinary versus integrated. A lot of times we just use them interchangeably, okay? And I don't think I need to really use words to describe them. If you look at these two pictures, which one is interdisciplinary, which one is integrated to these two dishes?
The right one is integrated.
That's integrated, right? So why you would say that's integrated?
Because in the left one it's just interdisciplinary, so like they're all together but they're all still separate, like
You can still tell.
yeah, you can still tell that there's different
We'll
things.
check
Integrated,
them, yeah.
it's like you wouldn't necessarily be able to like look at a piece and be like, oh, I know exactly what this is made of.
Mm-hmm.
And
Yeah.
interdisciplinary is kind of like, when I try and use some science where it's like heterogeneous,
Yeah.
and then integrated is like homogeneous.
Right. Yes. Exactly. I mean, that's how I distinguish these two terms. So, which one is better? Let's say if you want to do, say, connecting math and science or other subject matter, which one would you take and why? Yes.
Although I think there's a place for both, I would choose interdisciplinary because that way maybe you're more interested in like the math portion of that lesson or more interested in the science portion of that lesson. Since it's more defined, you can more easily transition into like going straight for the math part. I want to look up more math material for that, so it'd be easier to acquire more information about that.
Okay. So that's a great point. Other thoughts? Which one do you prefer and why?
Well, I think it also can kind of depend on like the student's preference, because like if a student doesn't like a certain subject, if you have it integrated, then maybe they won't necessarily tell that they're doing something based off of that. Like if a student really doesn't like math, but you're having them do like graphing and calculations based off of like information that you gave them about something, like some scientific like experiment or something, they may not be so turned off to it.
Resistant.
If they can't, if it's like not so obvious that it's math.
Yeah, it's also a great argument. So I mean, if you're eating the soup and you get ingredients, you get the nutrition anyway, right? Why do you have to tell it's a noodle, chicken, or whatever? Yeah. Other thoughts? Well, to me, I think I wouldn't consider one as better than the other. Of course, it depends on your needs, right? Are you teaching math, or are you teaching a particular discipline, or you just try to deliver some content without specific labels? And I think each approach has its, like you said, own place, right? It depends on what you need to do. So we probably need both in different settings. However, if you are, say, teaching math, or if you are teaching a particular science subject in a school setting, then this is probably what you're going to do. So you have to stick with these standards or learning objectives in your own discipline. You have to be able to tell, right? Oh, I'm doing calculus, I'm doing geometry, right? In this particular context, okay? So in this, I guess, presentation, I sort of use them interchangeably, but keep in mind, in different places we might have these two different this and on a continuum, okay? Well, I guess we all know, there are some benefits or challenges to interdisciplinary or integrated STEM education. So I use this term, iSTEM refers to either interdisciplinary or integrated STEM education, okay? The STEM becomes a buzzword. Okay? But actually, I think little work has been done to really think carefully, thoughtfully about how to integrate or how to connect science, technology, engineering, math. They just put these, terms together. So benefits, I mean, there actually have been like empirical studies in educational research settings showing, if we approach STEM in an interdisciplinary or integrated way, students, they increase their academic performance. They get more interested in the subject, and they probably know more about their future career options or want to explore more. But there are these challenges, One is our school infrastructure, right? They're still pretty much departmentalized. I don't know if in your school, does your math department talk a lot with your science department or English department?
They have meetings.
Yeah, they have
Yeah.
meetings.
Together.
Mhm.
Like we talk about it sometimes, the science teachers will ask, oh, have you covered this yet? And we'll go back and forth so we know what they should already know
Right.
and what the science teacher needs
Right.
to cover that we
Right.
haven't gotten to yet.
Okay.
We don't really talk.
Okay. Yeah.
If like you as a teacher want to,
Right.
I'll go and I'll talk with the physics teacher,
Right.
because I know we have a lot of overlap in our curriculums, and we'll talk about like when we're teaching what. But otherwise, the school doesn't really organize any interdisciplinary meetings.
So I guess it depends on the particular school, if the school want more collaboration or connections, otherwise if it's departmentalized, it's departmentalized. I mean, we know it's probably even worse at higher education level, right? And also, I mean, so in our setting, teacher prep, this is a unique kind of course, combined math and science methods. I mean, in the past, or in most places, we do math methods or science methods. And I'm not saying, this is necessarily better than the other, but that's the way we have been doing business, right? So if we want to do iSTEM, but we don't have really a workforce prepared to the iSTEM education, right? Another challenge assessment. Again, I mean, students are assessed or tested on individual disciplines. If you do iSTEM integrated, can you make sure they will do better in individual disciplines, or do we miss something when we do iSTEM if we just test the individual disciplines, right? I mean, these are the challenges. Again, just some of these. So how to approach iSTEM? So there's this National Research Council report put up by a committee. They were thinking about how to do integrated or interdisciplinary STEM education, and they proposed 3 principles. I think these are pretty good principles. One, integration should be made explicit, and it's so straightforward, so common sense, right? But it's actually not practiced a lot in schools. Even when we say, oh, we need to do interdisciplinary or integrated STEM education, but we have to make these either activities or contents explicitly connected to other subject matter. Okay? The second one, we also need to emphasize learning in individual disciplines must be supported. So this is more like the interdisciplinary approach we just talked about. We shouldn't abandon, based on this committee, they argue we shouldn't abandon the disciplines, which I totally agree. I think if even we take a integrated approach, we should say, oh, let's not worry about like math or science or these disciplines. And they want a more systematic, approach that can be evaluated or measured carefully, right? So, based on this report, based on the literature and my personal work, I actually have devoted in this area in the last, 5 years or so. I proposed my own framework, and for the remaining of the class, I will explain these components, okay? And this framework, I see it can be used to conceptualize, iSTEM curriculum development or even assessment, and facilitate student learning. Okay, and I basically break it down into 3 aspects. One is task contextualization. How do you conceptualize, design a task, a learning task, specific way. Boundary objects. So from a material perspective, what kind of things students can use, manipulate, or share if you're doing an interdisciplinary approach. Okay. Third one is I call it interdisciplinary reasoning and communication processes, IRC. So what students do exactly when they're learning interdisciplinary in an interdisciplinary context. Okay. So I will go through each and also provide some example, and then we can talk about these. Okay. So the first one, task contextualization. Again, here I refer to how we frame the learning tasks, right? I mean, if you're doing, say, calculating volume, that's your learning task. Students need to calculate, I don't know, the volume of the room or volume of an object, right? That's your learning task, right? So I argue if you want to facilitate interdisciplinary or integrated STEM education, your task, your learning task should consider why it's relevant or significant in terms of connecting the disciplines. So are the connections, say, between math and science or math and other subjects artificial because you're just putting this learning task? Or it's really natural. If you want to accomplish this task or solve this problem, the connections, you have to make these connections to solve the problem or to accomplish this learning task. Okay. So a few examples. So for example, engineering design. That becomes very popular in, I guess, pre-college education nowadays. I don't know, does your school, for those who work in school, does your school have engineering curriculum? Yes? And
I mean, engineering.
yeah.
Yeah.
But what I'm arguing is, even though it's not tested, but people can use it to argue, hey, engineering could help students learn literacy, math, science, because it's such a natural topic or field that you need to integrate these domains of knowledge, right? Right? And I have another curriculum related to food myth. So I ask students to investigate, myth related to food. And in that particular unit, it's sort of related to your everyday experience. But again, when you think about food, you can talk about its chemical composition, you can talk about its nutrition values, you can talk about its maybe biological aspects, right? Or even some physical chemical changes. You can talk about these different disciplinary knowledge. Even math, when you need to do calculations, say percentage of some ingredients, So, when you use these everyday experience as a learning task that drives students' learning, I think it very naturally requires students to connect these disciplines, right? Yeah. Okay. So again, when you think about your final project, I want you to think harder on what's your learning tasks. Are these naturally driving students to connect subject matter? Okay. Boundary objects, has a fancy name, but it's, again, quite intuitive. So when you think about if you want to do an interdisciplinary or integrated approach, students need to work on something, right? All these things, the items, the objects, naturally belong to one discipline or can be shared across disciplines. Okay? That's what these boundary objects are about. So boundary objects are shared and shareable objects used across different disciplinary contexts. Okay? Help represent, learn about, transform knowledge at the boundaries. So some examples, representations, graphs. We use graph in math, in science, in other domains, right? So when students they work on graphs, they produce graphs. These graphs can be, transferred or transported into a different class, right? You still talk about sort of similar graphs, right? One example, I guess, student artifacts. So let's say use the engineering design example. If you ask students to produce some artifacts, say a 3D model using some software, right? And these models, when you produce these artifacts, these artifacts can be presented or worked on in a math class or in a science class or in a computer science class, right? They can be carried over to different places, right? And the third one, cross-cutting concepts. Here I refer to these ideas like energy. You talk about in different contexts. You talk in biology, you talk about energy in physics, maybe not so much in math. But here I want to emphasize these sort of big ideas, cross-cutting concepts. If you want to conceptualize them as boundary objects, they need to be externalized, not just existing in learners' heads, right? They need to be externally represented. So again, students can move them across the boundaries, right? And then I think when you emphasize these boundary objects or you utilize these objects, they help make these interdisciplinary connections more explicit and visible. Again, the example. So what is this? Graph. So let's talk about, from a science perspective, what do you see?
Meters and seconds.
Great. You see units, right? Meters, seconds. Even though I did not even, write them out, but as long as you see you say, oh, meters, second. That relates to what? Certain phenomena, right? Speed, motion, right? Time. So there are things that automatically you want to attach to this graph. But this object itself is just a graph, right? What about mass? From a mass perspective, what do you see?
Line A has a greater slope than line B.
Greater slope, right? Than B. So you use these mathematical terms to describe what you see. Anything else?
There's a point of intersection.
Point of intersection that might represent something important, right? But mathematically speaking, it's an intersection between two lines. From a science perspective, maybe that means, anyone want to guess what does that mean? Again, if we talk about meter and second, we talk about distance and time.
That's where they meet.
That's where they meet. So it has a physical meaning, right? In the science domain. Okay? But again, being math or being science, you point to the same graph to talk about things, right? Okay? Now, the issue is, typically these things like graph, they're represented differently in different domains. So, so here, actually, I use y and x. That's more aligned with, say, a typical, say, math textbook, right? X-axis, y-axis. But if it's really a physics class, I wouldn't use those, right? I would use, in this case, x as position, or t as time, right? And so students could easily get confused. They see x here in physics class and x there in math class, if they don't really pay attention, right, to the meaning of those. Okay? So they become, actually, these boundary objects become problematic at these boundaries, right? And we need to really pay attention to the issues students might have, right? All right, that's just one example. Again, there are many other examples. So the third component, so we talked about task contextualization, we talked about boundary objects. The last component, interdisciplinary reasoning and communication processes, IRC processes. Okay? Does these refer to the cognitive or social processes people do, people carry out when, again, connecting disciplines? Okay? And in this aspect, I've been thinking about like these 4 different processes actually, and I'll explain each of them. All right. Any questions so far? No? All right, great. Integration. Again, when we talk about interdisciplinary STEM education, integrated STEM education, this seems a very natural term, right? We want to integrate subject matter from different disciplines. So this icon sort of helps me to remember what this integration means. So these little symbols represent, say, knowledge pieces or even methods or concepts, and the color simply means from different disciplines. So maybe, for example, the red comes from math, the green comes from physics, blue comes from earth science. Yeah. And so, but these concepts or methods are really connected and become structure, a whole, right, in order to solve some problem or accomplish some task. So that's what integration is about. Your ingredients, your components are coming from different disciplines to form a coherent whole. Any question on this? Conceptual? Okay, great. So this is an example. Cause of seasons. That's a very common topic in science, right? But when we teach that in science, I don't know if we are realizing it actually involves multiple disciplines. It's not just earth science topic. Of course, I mean, when we talk about tilt of Earth, revolution around the sun, I'm talking about the Earth, okay? Revolving around the sun, we talk about hemisphere. I mean, these concepts are typical earth science concepts, right? You have to explain to students. I mean, they have to learn what, say, tilt of the Earth means, what is a hemisphere, and these things, again, are typically taught, say, in earth science. But to really truly understand the cause of seasons, by the way, what's the cause of seasons? I assume you all know the answer. What causes seasons?
Wait, the sun hits the earth because of the tilt?
Because of the tilt. Yeah, the sun hits the earth. Well, that's basically it, right? But what does that mean? I mean, we need to really elaborate on that. Why the tilt of the earth would cause, say, warm in the summer, cold in the winter, right? So there's a lot more to that simple sentence, I think. Actually, even if we, sort of do not realize, we already talk about temperature on average, right? Warm and cold. That's what season is about, right? We talk about sunlight. It's really electromagnetic radiation, right? So you could ask, oh, why sunlight would, heat up things? Does this light heat up things?
Not to the same extent as the sun.
Not to the same extent. But that's something we already sort of assumed. Our students already learned somewhere. And we have not talked about these things when we were trying to explain cause of seasons, but they are actually, I believe, in the core of fully explaining cause of seasons. Parallel lines. Anyone can make a connection? How is that related to cause of seasons? Yes. Well, I was not actually thinking about that, but that has, of course, a connection, right? I did not put it there. Here I was thinking about sunlight. In a lot of textbooks, when you portray sunlight, you portray them as parallel lines. They hit the earth, right? Why? Why you portray them as parallel lines? That's actually not necessarily straightforward for our students. Let's say your student, I should have used, no, we don't have yellow, but let's say you have sun, right, and sun gives out light. These are not parallel lines. But if you remember, when you see a textbook explanation, say this is Earth, this is the tail of, sort of the axis, right? Sunlight hits. Remember this kind of picture? These are parallel lines, right? Why?
So then we can talk about the angles,
Then we can talk about angles.
because the tilt basically like creates like a transversal, and then we see like how it affects it.
Then what?
Like the tilt of the Earth essentially acts as a transversal, so then there's
Yes. I mean, again, that's an explanation, but going back, why we portray them as parallel lines. The parallel lines, because of its mathematical, property, it gives us the power of explanation, right? But why parallel lines? When we look at the sunline, this seems not parallel. What do you call those lines? Is there a mathematical term for that? I mean, they're non-parallel, right?
It depends. If they're lines, then you call those intersecting lines, because at some point they would intersect, unless they're skew lines, if you're talking in three-dimensional space.
Mm-hmm.
So it depends on what dimension we're thinking in,
I mean,
whether we're using lines or
yeah, I mean,
something else.
But anyway, so there's actually yeah, Luma?
Like, I was just trying to guess why they draw it like this, because basically parallel lines, obviously mathematically, conceptually, it means that they should never intersect, but there is another interpretation which says that the lines intersect at infinity, and so, I mean,
That's too
sun is
complicated.
at infinity.
But actually, well, that's part. Well, that's actually. You're right. We
You
say
see
this
the
is
parallel
parallel lines
tracks?
because they actually do converge at infinity because the sun is so far away. So this is approximation, okay? Remember the scale of the solar system. The sun is so far away, and our Earth is just a tiny dot. Okay? Because if we do not use parallel lines, it will be much harder to explain cause of seasons. Okay? And I'll show later. Okay? So there's some already mathematics, inherently in these explanations that we typically, again, in a science class, we typically ignore. We don't talk about like why parallel lines, right? And angle ratio, you talk about angle, right? Parallel lines gives us explanation because, all the lines hit this surface with the same angle, right? Ratio. Why ratio would come into the equation when we try to explain cause of sequence? Well, I will explain this later when I talk about the transfer. But the point being, actually, again, my point is to fully explain cause of seasons. Just using these earth science terms or concepts are not sufficient. You have to integrate, combine, connect, say some math terms, even some physics terms. Okay? Or sunlight, energy, these are seen like everyday language, okay? Translation. Again, I will go back to the ratio later on, okay? So, think about the terms we brought up. If you really immerse yourself in one discipline, you may not be familiar with other disciplines, right? So when you encounter these new terms, you don't necessarily understand those terms from that particular disciplinary perspective, right? You might take on your own explanation, okay? So what I want to emphasize into the translation is you map these scientific vocabularies and terms among disciplines in order to really communicate and sometimes collaborate with others, right? So we want to make sure we are talking about the same thing that we agreed upon, okay? So this little icon that helped me to remember this term. So for example, I mean, all these are, say, maybe math concepts or math terms. All these are science terms. So you need to make connections. Maybe these two terms are talking about the same thing, or similar things at least, right? So an example. Again, there's so many other examples. Sunlight. When we say sunlight, what do we mean? If you want to add the disciplinary layer, the content layer, in geometry, as I mentioned, parallel rays. Again, when you look at when sunlight hits the surface of the earth, okay? That's approximation. That's a good model to model sunlight. Why parallel rays? Because they have certain features we want to use, right? In physics, we talk about radiation, right? But here, are we talking about the whole spectrum or just visible, right? So we know we can see sunlight, but there are other portions of sunlight we cannot see, right? Is the other portion still sunlight? You can also talk about sunlight in terms of form of energy transfer, right? It's how these EM waves move from one place to another place, another location. And in biology, we can talk about, oh, sunlight, yeah, it's a source of energy here on Earth, right? So, so these interpretations or further explanations attached to some term might carry the specific disciplinary perspective, right? If you're not familiar with these interpretations, it might be very hard for you to integrate or connect. Okay? Any question? So I guess the message I want to deliver is you need to pay attention to these terms, to these discipline-specific terms. Okay? For example, when we talk about graph, you brought the term slope. Well, then in a non-math setting, people might attach different meanings to the term slope, right? But in math, it has a very specific meaning, right? Transfer, okay? So this idea is similar to what we talk about transfer in general. So you learn something, and you apply what you've learned, say concepts, theories, models, tools, from one discipline to another discipline. Right? So, for example, we've learned how to interpret slope in a math class. Now you're able to apply this knowledge to interpret like motion, right, in a physics class. Right? So you transfer what you learned from one context, one discipline in this case, to another discipline. Okay? So this little icon means, so for instance, you've learned something, some knowledge, some structure in, say, math, and you apply it to science context, the blue box. But keep in mind, the central core structure does not change. Okay? The meaning of slope, that core structure, does not necessarily change, right? Okay? So the example, going back to sunlight or cause of seasons. Okay? I mean, we learned, say, this in geometry class. I should have, more put in more details. So what I want to illustrate here is how do I do that? So I have to make sure it's perpendicular, right? What do you call this? Not the area. Well, it's area of light beam, but if you think it in a two-dimensional world, let's say, I mean, these two length are equal, right? Again, if we say, if they are equal in length, but if in this case they're projected perpendicular to the surface, but this is slanted, there's an angle, what you will have here, this length will be greater, right? Right? So you can use some simple trigonometry, I guess, to calculate the ratio between this and this, right? So here this represents, for example, energy density. How do I say that? Energy, density of energy, density of energy, density of energy. Total energy divided by this area, right? Well, if it's a three-dimensional area. Versus this energy, this much energy containing this light beam over now this new area, right? A prime, right? And we know from trigonometry A prime is greater than A, so this ratio, which one is greater? This one is greater, right? This is greater than this, right? That's why I think ratio comes into play when you think about, when the sunlight hits a particular surface, if it's perpendicular, you get more concentrated energy, right? The energy density is higher versus when it's tilted, right? You're using the same knowledge here, right? And to me, that's a transfer because you've learned this. Let's say in geometry, you should be able to apply and move it into a different context, right? Question on this? No? So to me, that's part of the explanation for cosmic seasons. Okay? And the other part of the explanation is in the summer actually, the hours are longer, so you accumulate more sunlight exposure, right? You're exposed longer to the sun. Okay? Let's see. The last one. So we've talked about integration, so integrate things, right? We've talked about translation, attend to these vocabulary, terminology. We talk about transfer, you apply something you learned in one discipline to another. And then I think the last process, typically at a higher level, is transformation. You need to apply what you've learned to change something in another context, in another discipline. So now it's not just use and apply it. Now you need to change, right? You need to create. You need to revise, okay? So that's what transformation is about. So you apply something you've learned in one discipline, and if you look at the icon here, and you sort of transform this thing to something that's unknown yet. Okay? Example, if we really understand cause of seasons, the knowledge pieces involved, and now think about when you install these solar panels on, say, your house rooftop. Other than, say, the materials, the price, and all that, you also need to think about where should I put, which angle. Should I face east, south, west, or should I tilt them so that I actually will receive the most energy from the sun? Right? Because you understand it's all about the angles, right? Of course, there's a lot more to just the angles. Okay, you need to take into consideration, how the sun changes its path over months, over days. So the point is, you can change, you can make an adjustment to the ways people install, say, solar panels. Okay. All right. Well, another example, I mean, you can get a lot of examples from biomimicry, right? You study some, biological phenomena, say a tree frog. They're like toe pads, certain patterns, right? That will help them to attach to like surface easily, right? And you actually apply those and actually change the way we make tires. Okay? This is just one interesting example. So those are the four processes that I have generated, come up with from our own studies, and I found they helpful for me to think about ISTEM curriculum or assessment or learning processes. Okay, great. So now let's do a very quick quiz or test. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to introduce a project I lead, or I co-lead with my colleague. And this is, to me, this is an example of an ISTEM project or program, okay? After I describe the project, the program, you need to reflect, write it down. In your view, what's the task contextualization? What are some of the boundary objects that you can think of in this project? And what are the IRC processes that can be facilitated? The integration, translation, transfer, transformation processes that can be facilitated in a program.
Project Imagine the Future aims to help middle school students develop core competencies in digital literacies and STEM practices through collaborative learning. Participating students will engage in a weekend program at the University of Miami where they will collaborate in small groups to create a science fiction story. Students will explore a variety of new skills, such as movie making, animation, and game creation. During the creative process, the UM research team, led by Dr. G. Shen and Dr. Blaine Smith, will provide support in terms of writing, technology training, and science lessons related to the fiction topics students choose. Each student will contribute to the project through differentiated, self-selected roles, such as writer, scientist, and designer. Students will have the opportunity to visit UM scientists' research labs and learn from a variety of distinguished presenters. For more information or to join IF Club, please visit our website.
So they will produce what we call multimedia science fiction. They use some online tool, in this case Scratch, right, to produce cartoon comics, and they write about the story, and I think some places they're putting some music. So what would you say is task contextualization in this particular program? Yes. Go ahead.
So, and tell me if I'm getting this right, the task conceptualization is when we're talking about it's like naturally flowing, really, kind of like how it's framed.
Mm-hmm.
So.
How learning tasks or learning activities.
And that's when we were talking about like the engineering design, how like some of it kind of goes hand in hand and some of it feels more forced. I feel like when you were describing it, at least, that like the multimedia part of the science fiction, like a lot of it seemed to go really hand in hand with itself, that it wasn't really like forced.
Mm-hmm.
So I didn't think this through before I started speaking. Never mind, Mike. I'm passing to you.
So one of the things I was thinking of was especially like a program like Scratch, you're using a lot of
Yeah.
logic skills.
Yeah.
So you're combining a lot of like mathematical like proof, kind of like explicit like step-by-step processes, along with like art design. So right there, you're actually combining not even just the sciences, but actually like art design. And I would see that as like a little bit of contextualization, like that's like a free flowing in between those two areas. You need to be able to write the code as well, and then right there you're also incorporating literacy, literacy abilities. Well, not really with Scratch necessarily, but.
So you're actually talking about the processes, so either multimedia or use a particular coding environment, you sort of need to integrate, right, these practices or skills. But step back, again, I mean, this is actually a simple question. Task contextualization, so here, what's the driving learning task for the students that are participating in the program?
Create like a science fiction.
Yes, creating a multimedia science fiction. That's how we contextualize, conceptualize the learning environment for this particular group of students in your program, right? Now, when you think about creating, producing multimedia science fiction, automatically it needs to integrate, because of the multimedia aspect, right? You need to put in some artistic design, ability or knowledge into the story writing. So that's linking arts and writing, right? And because it's science fiction, so you need to contribute scientific knowledge. Because it's science fiction, it's not just, any fiction, right? So this task itself automatically asks students to link, I think, science and writing. Okay? Does that make sense? So to me, that's how we conceptualize, contextualize student learning in this program, and we argue this particular task already automatically asks students to do I-STEM. Okay? So that's pretty, simple, straightforward. What about boundary objects? Can you think of some examples? Yeah, too bad I cannot show. Actually, let me go to this place. So they are using platform I've been developing. So they use a online learning system to share, to create these knowledge entries, to share their stories. Back to some music. That's what they chose anyway. So yeah, we can hear music here. So that's just one scene in the story. A house was burned down and the kid took a rocket to another planet, something like that. It's kind of simple, but yeah. So anyway, these are the things they actually produced in the middle. So what would be some of the boundary objects? Again, if you use a framework. Yes?
Could you say that animations are boundary objects?
Right.
Because you can use them in like a literary sense, because they're telling a story, but you could also incorporate like the science behind it, whether it's like the rocket, I don't know if you want to calculate the speed it has to go to leave the planet or something, I don't know. But you can incorporate it into like a science classroom, because you're talking about science fiction as well.
Yes. Again, it's a very simple idea. This animation, the object itself, you can talk about this object in a science class, in a writing class, in an arts class, or in a technology class, you talk about animation design, right? And actually, Mike, you brought an example, say, Scratch coding, so you need to, you can talk about that in a, I don't know, do you offer computer science class? Or do you offer computer science class?
I want to start it next year, but I'm not going back to the school, so.
But you also mentioned like some logic, which are, I don't know, related to math. Or you can, again, the same idea. You can talk about this thing in different classrooms, right? And actually students' actual writing. Now you can talk about their writing because some of the writings, they incorporate some science ideas. So you can talk about it in science class or in a writing class, right? That artifact itself, I think, is a boundary object. Okay? All right. So we talked about task contextualization. We talked about boundary objects. And so what about RC? Do you see integration, translation, transfer, or transformation in this kind of program into the student learning or interaction?
Yeah, because obviously you're integrating all these different like disciplines like writing or English and science and computer stuff.
Right. Put them together.
Yeah, and they're creating something new. Like they're still like using their knowledge to make up this story and make these animations up and.
Right. I agree. So you need to, put in these different pieces from different disciplinary background and make a new product, right? Multimedia science fiction that they produce at the end, it's a new thing, right? So that's transformation and integration, right, already. What about translation or transfer? Remember, translation is all about terminology, right? It's very hard because I just explained this project in like a minute or 2 minutes. So for example, because we assign roles, right? So say writer, scientist, designer, right, in a small team. They need to talk with each other to produce the final product. So for example, if their story is about space traveling, that's a common theme students love to pick, right? Then the scientist would add a lot of things, say what kind of rocket we need, to travel to a really long distance. But the thing is, if the kid is really science-oriented, loves science, and he would throw in a lot of these terms, right? What kind of engines and things like that. But, team members may not understand, right? So they would ask, oh, what do you mean? How can we incorporate that into our story? And one team used a species called tardigrade. Have you heard about this? It's kind of like little,
Water bears.
Yeah, it's called water bears, but I don't even know what kind of species this belongs to, but I think its official name is like tardigrade. And this thing can survive in outer space. It does not need like energy or light or whatever. It can just survive. So they think, if there's like alien bring this thing to the Earth and there's some virus associated with it, blah, blah. But they want to make it more like scientific, right? So they need to explain to others, either within their team or to the rest of the class, what is tardigrade, how does that work, right? But anyway, so I think that involves a lot of translation. And in terms of the designer, say that artist perspective, he or she might need to apply some, particular skills when he or she creates certain animations. And that needs to be explained or translated so that others can understand. A lot of times it comes down to really communication, okay? What about transfer? Let me give you a hint. So now when students are working on this project, like in this program, do they need to apply anything they've learned before? Of course. They need to apply what they learn about how to say or write a story. Actually, I mean, all of them literally I've learned, like, there's this diagram I actually did not know because I'm not like a literacy teacher. Like, if you write a story, you have like a, what's the beginning of climax? Like, what's that chart?
Yeah, the climax and then the.
Yeah, the mountain.
Like there's so many weird things.
There's a name for it, but it's just with the climax that you go down.
Yeah, so like,
Yeah.
they've already learned, right, in a writing class. So they just need to apply that when they produce their final fiction. Okay? So things like that, you know. So to me, that's a transfer, right? Okay. So again, that's just one example, and in the coming weeks, we will go through a few more examples to elaborate more on iSTEM curriculum. So with the hope that when you work in teams, I want you to think both theoretically and also practically, you know, to make your final project more integrated or interdisciplinary.